Hello and welcome to Modern Thatch Living. I recently got interested in making bread. Now, when I first started to look at recipes, it all seemed a bit mysterious. There seemed to be quite a lot of variation in the different recipes, and it wasn't very clear to me what each of the components actually did. So what I'd like to do today for you is to show you making a loaf of bread to my own recipe and explain to you what I think each of the ingredients is doing. So let's go to the kitchen and make a loaf of bread. So what we're going to do is make a bread that's flavoured with oranges and lemons. So the first thing to do is prepare the zest of a lemon and prepare the zest of an orange. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is put 20 grams of olive oil into the lemon and orange zest, and I'll explain what the oil does later on to the bread. But I'm adding it to the zest now, so the oils that give orange and lemon their flavour are drawn out into the olive oil before I add the oil to the bread. Well, I'm going to leave these to sit for a while I prepare the rest of the ingredients. So I use a bread maker to prepare the dough. In theory you can cook the bread in the bread maker as well, but I find that that doesn't work very well, and you get much nicer bread if you cook it in the oven. So the first thing you need to do is add some water. So I'm going to add 100 mils of water to the bread making bowl. And I'm going to add some milk. I'm going to add 200 mils of milk. And I'll talk about what the milk does in just a minute. So, the main ingredients obviously is flour. And what I'm going to do is add 450 grams of strong white flour to the milk and water. Now, flour has a protein in it called gluten, and the gluten will form polymers, which are like strings of elastic, and they're what give the bread its body. And what the other ingredients do is control the consistency of the bread by interacting with the gluten polymer. So, put the flour in with the milk and water. Now the oil that we're going to add, which is sitting with the lemon and orange zest at the minute, breaks up the protein polymers and makes shorter chains. So the bread strands, the gluten polymer strands, become shorter. So oil shortens the bread, and what that does is it makes the structure of the bread finer and less stringy, and it changes the texture of the bread to make it more crumbly. So what we're going to do now is add the oil with the lemon and orange zest. Now the milk that I added also has oil in it, and that again helps the structure of the bread and helps make it a finer, more crumbly texture at the end. It also makes the crust a little bit softer, but importantly the milk gives the bread the characteristic of browning quite nicely when you make toast, which if you don't put the milk in you don't see. So the reaction of sugars which are found in milk with protein create the browning characteristic that you get when you put bread into a toaster. Or in fact, it's when you cook any food, the sort of browning is a reaction called the Maillard reaction, which is a reaction of sugar with protein. Anyway, the next step is to add some yeast. Now obviously yeast is an organism that uses sugar to produce carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide produces bubbles in the bread. So I'm going to add 7 grams of yeast. I'll put that on one side of the bowl. And the yeast needs some food, which is sugar. I'm going to put some sugar on top of the yeast, and this is going to be a relatively sweet bread, so I'm going to put two teaspoons of sugar on top of the yeast. So the yeast and the sugar produce gas bubbles, and they produce the bubbles inside the bread, and if you put more oil in, the gluten fibers become shorter, and so you get smaller bubbles in the bread. Whereas if you put less oil in, you'll get a more open structure to the bread. And the other thing, and this puzzled me for a long while, is you add some salt, and the salt controls the activity of the yeast and limits it. If you put too much salt in, you get very, very dense bread. If you don't put enough yeast in, then you get a very open, bubbly structure. So I usually find about this much salt works well. And I put it on the other side of the bowl in the bread mixer, so that it's not near the yeast, because it will actually limit the growth of the yeast quite dramatically, and we want to get it started quite quickly. Right, so I think that's everything in there. There's yeast, sugar, oil, flour, water. So there's 100 mils of water and 200 mils of milk in there. The milk adds some protein as well as some additional sugar. If you want it to be not quite so sweet, but you want to still get the extra protein and fats in there, you can use an egg instead. So next step is to put the mixture into the bread maker. Now I use a bread maker because we don't have anywhere warm in the house, like an airing cupboard, that would be suitable for this. And the advantage of a bread maker is that it does all the kneading as well. So put it into the bread maker, lid down and set it to go. And that now needs to be left for an hour and a half to do its thing. In about an hour, what I will do is come in and turn the oven on to 220 degrees C, so that the oven is really hot when I actually come to put the bread into it. So you're just going to put some olive oil on this tray. And well grease the bread tin that I'm going to use. The bread has now had an hour and a half in the bread maker, and so it's time to put it in the oven. As I said previously, cooking in the oven makes much nicer bread than trying to cook in the bread maker, although it does, you can make the bread in the bread maker, and I've tried doing that. It just doesn't end up quite so nice. Just coat the outside of the bread with olive oil. And then put it in the tin, bread tin I'm going to use, and push it down into the corners. Shape it a bit, then just leave it to stand for a few minutes. So I've set the oven at 220 degrees, and I'm going to put bread in there. I'm going to cook it for half an hour, but I'm going to leave it at the 220 degrees for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'll turn it down to 180 for the rest of the cooking time. The reason for that is I'll get a thinner crust if I turn the temperature down halfway through. If you want slightly thicker, chewier crust, then leave it at 220 for the full half an hour. Right. Well, here we are. The bread's now cooled down a little bit. It's still slightly warm, about as warm as you might get from the bakery. So, as you can see here, got fairly small air bubbles, and it's a really nice texture. The crust isn't too thick, and all in all that's worked really well. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed watching me make this loaf of bread and found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.